Dead America, The Second Month, Seattle Rebuild, Part 6. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Rebuild, Day 6.
"Are you 100% sure about this?"
General Stevens asked, his voice strained. He sat at the head of a large conference table with Corporal Gadd and Clint on either side. A map spread below him, along with several pages of notes and figures. "About as close to 100% as we're going to get, sir," Gadd replied firmly. Stevens took a deep breath, lacing his fingers on both sides and setting them down on the table in front of him.
"Clint?"
he asked quietly.
"Gadd's right,"
Clint confirmed.
"Nothing these days is 100%, but this is as close as it's ever going to get."
The general looked at the map at a town called Bellingham that was circled with bright red marker. It was on the coast, 25 miles north of the barricade at Burlington.
"Who's the source of this information?"
he finally asked. Gadd and Clint shared a look and the former stammered. "One of our civilian expeditions reported it," he winced, knowing the storm that was going to follow.
"Wait,"
Stevens snapped, leveling an agitated stare at the corporal.
"You sent civilians that far north of the barricade?"
"We felt they were capable of handling the situation," Clint cut in sternly.
"Who are these people?"
the general demanded. "A local biker gang," Gadd replied. Stevens took in a deep breath, closing his eyes and shaking his head slowly, as if he were counting backwards from 10 to control a storm of rage.
"A biker gang?"
he finally asked, voice wavering.
"You want to completely deplete our emergency ammunition reserves, based on what a biker gang told you?"
"Yes, sir," Gadd said, firmer this time.
"Do you really trust this biker gang?"
Stevens asked, suddenly sounding exhausted.
"I trust they want the negotiated cut,"
Clint replied. The general jutted out his chin.
"How big of a cut?"
he asked dryly.
"Big enough to get them motivated to risk their lives,"
Clint said simply, "but small enough that we wouldn't notice it."
"Fair enough,"
Stevens muttered, and then leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin as he fell deep into thought for a few moments. He stared at the map, but it didn't look like he was really seeing it, more like looking through it.
"Are there any other options?"
he finally murmured. Clint shrugged.
"Kill 20% of the civilians?"
he joked. Gadd glared at him, shaking his head.
"What?"
Clint replied with a shrug. "Better than everybody starving to death."
"Point taken,"
Stevens groaned. He got up from the table and paced around for a few moments. This decision could be the difference between making and breaking Seattle, and he knew that. It was a huge weight for any person to bear.
"Tell me what we know,"
he finally said. "Buck, the leader of the gang," Gadd began. "He said that they found a few smaller stores with food still on the shelves, which hasn't been the case elsewhere." Clint nodded, leaning forward.
"That leaves us to believe that whatever happened in Bellingham happened too quickly for people to get to safety," he explained.
"Which is why we are confident that the Supercenter distribution center wasn't raided," Gadd finished. Stevens sighed, halting his pacing.
"Did they not have visual confirmation on what's inside the distribution center?"
he asked. "No, but that's actually a good thing in this case," the corporal replied.
"How can that be good?"
the general challenged.
"We don't have visual confirmation because there were thousands of zombies surrounding the building,"
Clint explained. Stevens stared at him for a moment and then leaned forward against the table.
"I've known you for years,"
he said slowly,
"and every Christmas I've bought you some high-dollar scotch. This year, I'm buying you a goddamn dictionary because you obviously don't know what the word good means."
Clint chuckled.
"I assure you that good is the appropriate word," he said. "With that many zombies, it's highly unlikely anybody was able to get anything out of that place, at least in any significant amount. Are there not any other distribution centers in the region?"
Stevens asked with a sigh. Gad shook his head. There are a few, but they were either close enough to the safe zone that we've already raided it, or they were cleared out, he replied.
This appears to be the only one that hasn't been touched, Clint explained.
The general chewed his lip for a moment, and then leveled the corporal with a stare.
How big of a force can we send? He asked.
We pulled every resource that we could, and we managed to come up with enough for 40 soldiers, Gad replied.
Do you have a plan?
Stevens asked dryly.
Or are you just winging it?
Clint shrugged sheepishly.
We have a vague idea of a plan, he said. So, more than usual? The general asked.
Clint smirked.
Pretty much, sir,
he replied brightly.
Okay,
Stevens finally said.
Do what needs to be done. Keep me in the loop.
They responded with yes, sir, and he held up a hand before moving towards the door.
Oh, and we're having a briefing this evening, and I need you two there, he said. Hopefully with an update on this situation. If you can, please have that hippie. Well, what's her name?
Harmony? Gad asked dryly.
Yeah, please have her here as well,
Stevens said, snapping his fingers.
When I have a specific time, I'll have a runner come let you know. In the meantime, do what you do best. Get the team, brief them, and send them out to do what they do best.
They responded in the affirmative again, and then he swept from the room, sharing a look that clearly showed their sentiments. Something along the lines of, holy hell, what did we get ourselves into? So, what now? Gad asked, taking a deep breath. Clint tapped the end of his pencil on the table.
You got anybody off the top of your head who can pull this off? He asked.
Gad nodded. Yeah, I was looking over some of the Seattle invasion reports last night, and a few names stood out, he replied.
Jesus, man. We do have libraries in town if you need something to read,
Clint teased. The corporal shrugged. Why focus on a fictional world when ours is constantly changing in radical and terrifying ways? He asked.
Good point,
Clint conceded, and motioned to him with his pencil.
Okay, if you want to round them up, I'll handle transportation.
Where you want to stage them? Gad asked.
Up by the northern depot where Captain Matthews is, Clint replied. I'm pretty confident we're going to have to go by ship, so we can cast off from there.
1 hour? The corporal asked.
Make it 45 minutes, Clint replied.
Done, Gad said, and got to his feet. Both men collected their things and headed out of the room, ready to get another impossible mission off of the ground. Chapter 2. 40 soldiers milled about, packing their gear as a snow flurry made an already cold morning even colder. The two leaders of the group stood off to the side, Captain Hooper waving as Corporal DeVille approached him.
How are we looking, Corporal?
Hooper asked. DeVille wrinkled his nose.
Cold and confused, sir, he said dryly.
Hooper smirked and clapped him on the shoulder.
Just like a typical morning in the sandbox, huh? He asked.
Never understood how the desert could get so cold, DeVille muttered.
I'm sure it was just to spite you, the captain replied.
DeVille chuckled, shaking his head as he rubbed his hands together. Not surprising, given how much of a bitch it was day in and day out, he said.
At least it wasn't boring,
Hooper quipped. The corporal cocked a brow. Is that how they're describing this mission, Captain? He asked.
Wish I knew,
Hooper replied, shaking his head.
I was just told to assemble the men and bring our guns with us.
Oh boy, DeVille drawled, rolling his eyes. Do you think they found a bullet or two for us? The captain snorted.
With our luck, they found some bayonets to stick on the ends of the rifles.
As they stood there, watching the men get ready, 2 pickup trucks pulled up, both loaded down with boxes.
Looks like it's showtime,
Hooper said, and led his companion over to the trucks as 2 men got out.
You Captain Hooper?
A corporal asked.
I'm Hooper,
the captain confirmed, motioning to his partner.
This is Corporal DeVille.
Everyone shook hands as the civilian said,
I'm Clint, and this is Corporal Gadd."
"Civilian, huh?" Hooper asked, cocking a brow.
Clint shrugged. "Wasn't always that way, and it's an all-hands-on-deck situation," he replied.
"Understandable," Hooper replied, and waved a hand around his head.
"So, you boys want to let us in on the big secret of why we're out here freezing our balls off?"
Gadd took a deep breath.
"You're in for a hell of a day, Captain," he said, and pulled out a satellite image printout with several things circled. "This is the town of Bellingham, about 90 miles to the north." He pointed to the barricade. "This line here is Burlington, which is our northern barricade to protect against the Canadian horde."
"What's the target?" Hooper asked as he studied the sheet.
"An untouched supercenter distribution center," Clint replied.
The soldiers exchanged a glance, the type of knowing glance that they were in for quite a day with a beast of a job.
"This should be fun," DeVille quipped.
"Things that die that sending us into the middle of a horde is the only viable option?" Hooper asked dryly. Clint and Gadd exchanged their own glance, unsure of how much to disclose. Clint finally settled on saying, "Without going into too much detail, yes, it is that dire." Hooper sighed.
"Okay, lay it out for us," he said.
"We have information that this supercenter distribution warehouse is untouched, or at least not fully looted," Gadd explained. "Your mission is to get in there, load up as much of the non-perishable food as you can into the semis that are still in the lot, and bring it back down here." Hooper cocked his head.
"DeVille, how many truck drivers do we have in the unit?" he asked.
The corporal tilted his head back and forth as he did some mental counting.
9, maybe 10,
he finally replied. "Is that going to be enough?" Hooper asked, turning back to the other two.
Clint shrugged. "Going to have to be," he said.
"Shouldn't be an issue, because from the intel on the ground, they only spotted 7 or 8 trucks at the warehouse," Gadd explained. DeVille nodded slowly.
"Shouldn't be that big of a deal," he said. "Get in, load up, and head out on the highway."
Clint hesitated.
"If it were that easy, we wouldn't have requested this many men," he said slowly.
The corporal sighed. "Here it comes," he said, throwing up his hands. "There are a couple thousand zombies around the distribution center," Gadd explained. Hooper nodded, not seeming surprised.
"Explains why it hasn't been touched," he said.
"How are we supposed to get through that?" DeVille asked. 40 guys with bats isn't exactly formidable against those kinds of numbers."
Clint smirked. "Good thing we brought party favors," he said, and smacked one of the boxes in the back of the first truck. "Full extended loadout for everybody. You're going in fully armed and then some.
Just make sure every shot counts, because this is literally the last of our reserves when it comes to ammunition," Gadd said firmly. The captain cocked a brow.
"Any explosives?" he asked.
Clint nodded.
6 grenades, 2 plastic explosive charges," he replied,
and then raised a palm at the defeated looks on their faces.
I know. High explosives weren't high up on the list of things to grab when they were retreating in the first days of this. It's what we got, so use it wisely."
Hooper looked over his shoulder and let out a sharp whistle, waving for a nearby private to come over.
"Yes, sir,"
the young private asked.
"Jenkins, start distributing the ammunition to the troops," he instructed. "Extended loadout."
Jenkins's eyes went wide like a kid's on Christmas morning.
"Yes, sir,"
he said excitedly, and ran off to grab a few more men to help him with the task.
"Good to know we aren't going in empty-handed,"
Hooper said as the men started to distribute the ammunition.
"So, what's the plan?" "Of course, we leave the specifics up to you, since it's your ass on the line," Clint said. "But once you are geared up, we have 2 cutters that will take you north and drop you south of Fairhaven, which is a suburb of Bellingham. It's a couple of miles to the target from there."
"Why a couple of miles?" DeVille asked, crossing his arms.
"Closest we can get you without risking a major zombie encounter," Gadd explained. "Our scouts had a hell of a time yesterday navigating the place. They managed to slip away undetected, and this was their pickup spot."
Hooper nodded slowly.
"Are we sure they weren't followed?" he asked.
"In my experience, those things are like bloodhounds, picking up friends along the way."
"They sat offshore for an hour after pickup to make sure," the corporal explained.
If there is resistance there, it is going to be minimal. DeVille crossed his arms. So, we know how we're getting in. How are we getting out? He asked. I'm assuming the interstate is out of the question? Clint nodded. It is, he confirmed. The barricade team in Burlington have had their hands full the last few days, and word is there's a mess of other creatures coming down the pipeline. Gad pulled out a folded map of the area and spread it out. A bright yellow highlighted area ran along the coast from the southern part of Bellingham all the way to Burlington, veering off to the west just before it. This is Highway 11 that is way off the beaten path and runs along the coast, Gad explained. We sent a scout to check it out yesterday, and they reported that it's mostly clear. DeVille blinked at him. Mostly? He asked. Few stragglers, nothing that will prevent the convoy from getting through, Clint corrected. Gad pointed to a spot a few miles north of Burlington, where the road veered off. There is a farm-to-market road in this area that will take you to the west, he said. That will get you around Burlington and back into Seattle. The northern part is still being cleared out, so use the CB radio on Channel 12 to let us know when you're close. We'll have somebody monitoring it who can navigate you in, assuming there are any breakouts. Hooper took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Why do I get the feeling it's not as easy as that? He muttered. You're a sharp one, Captain, Clint said with a wan smile. Lay it on me, Hooper said, clapping his hands together. The only way to get from the warehouse to the highway is to go right through the heart of town, Clint said slowly, which is swarming with zombies. DeVille cocked a brow in confusion. We'll be in big rigs, he said. Why can't we just plow through them? He looked at the three men expectantly. Those things have a nasty habit of getting up into the wheel wells, puncturing tires, jamming things up, Gad explained. I can assure you the last place you want to break down is in the middle of a pack of those things. Clint nodded. Especially with more in your six coming your way, he added. How big of a mob are we talking about? Hooper asked, rubbing his chin in thought as he stared at the map. The scouts didn't do a formal head count, Gad said, but they estimated around 500 right in the center of town. Clint pointed to a spot on the map as he did. About a mile from the interstate, too, so make too much noise and you'll bring more right to you. So much for high explosives, DeVille muttered. Hooper shrugged and glanced at him. What do you think, Corporal? He asked. Can you get it done with 10? If I say no, will it get me more men? DeVille asked hopefully. Hooper chuckled and shook his head. Probably not, he replied. Then, yeah, I can absolutely get it done with 10. DeVille confirmed. Any word on what's in the area? He looked up at the other two men. What do you mean? Gad asked, brow furrowing. Like, where am I going to put 500 zombies? DeVille asked, spreading his hands. Can't make too much noise, so just opening fire on them isn't going to cut it, because the interstate is a mile to the east. Speaking of, can't pull them to the east without walking right into another mob. Guessing we're too close to the water to make going west viable, too. Gad held out the satellite image, which was too far out to really see much of anything. Our scouts didn't include anything in their report on that, he admitted. But maybe you can get some ideas from this? DeVille squinted as he stared at the image, trying to see anything that might work. Clint snapped his fingers. Hang on, I got you, he said, and headed for the truck. Oh, thank God, DeVille said with a smile. Hopefully you have some closer-in images. He trailed off when, instead of images, Clint stood there holding out a magnifying glass. Really? He sighed. Welcome to my world, Clint quipped. The satellites have been spotty at best recently, and with all the various targets we need imagery of, this is the best we can do. DeVille took the magnifying glass begrudgingly and ran it across the map for a time, before shaking his head. You can keep that, by the way, Clint said. Got lucky and found a hobby shop a couple of days ago that had a stack of them. The corporal sighed. Thanks, he muttered. So, what else do you need from us? Gad asked. DeVille and Hooper exchanged a look, and then finally shrugged. I got nothing, the corporal said. Hooper nodded. I think we're good, gentlemen, he said. Okay, Captain, do your thing, Clint said.
Gad and I have 100 other fires to put out, but those 2 will be at your disposal should you need anything else." He motioned to the second truck with 2 soldiers sitting inside. "When you're ready, we have boats waiting to take you out to the cutters," Gad said. "Good luck." He and Clint got back into their truck and drove off, and Hooper and DeVille turned to look at their men, just finishing up with the distribution of ammo. "This is going to be a long day, ain't it, Captain?" DeVille asked dryly. Hooper smirked. "Only if we don't fuck up and get eaten," he said, clapping his friend on the shoulder. "Always the great motivator," DeVille muttered. The 2 men shared a laugh as they headed into the crowd of soldiers, joining them in preparing for the coming mission. Chapter 3. The 2 ships rode up the coast over the waves. Hooper looked out the window and didn't look away from the water as DeVille joined him. "About 10 minutes out, sir," the corporal said. "You have your men ready?" Hooper asked. DeVille nodded. "Yes, sir," he replied. "There are 10 of us, including myself." "Is that enough to get the job done?" Hooper asked, worrying at his lip as he turned to face his companion. "You can have more if you need them." The corporal shook his head. "I think I can manage with that," he said. "We have to be stealthy after all. Well, moderately stealthy, at any rate. Going to have to pick our shots well. With any luck, we'll be able to time our escape to go along with your clearing," Hooper said. "Might be able to unload if the timing is right." The corporal nodded. "That would make life a lot easier," he agreed. They both turned towards the window, watching the shore go by. The snow flurries had picked up, some of it sticking to the coastline in white rivulets. Hooper nodded, a smile growing on his face. DeVille cocked a brow. "Not the expression I expected to see," he said. "Sorry, just triggered a memory," the captain said. "The snow?" DeVille asked. Hooper nodded. "The snow on the beach," he said. "Just reminds me of the off-season back home." "Didn't figure you for a beach bum, Cap," DeVille said, amused. The captain chuckled. "Hardly," he drawled. "Grew up in Traverse City, Michigan. Small resort town off of Lake Michigan. Family ran a bed and breakfast there, which was usually packed to the gills during the summertime. Everybody from Chicago wanting to escape the heat and hectic lifestyle of the city would come up there." He smiled wistfully. Come winter time, however, that city was a ghost town. "I spent a week in Chicago during the winter. That was enough for me," DeVille said with a shiver. "That wind could cut right through you." "Traverse City is way to the north of Chicago, and right on the water with nothing to slow that wind down," Hooper explained. "Made Chicago look like a Florida getaway some days." The corporal wrinkled his nose with distaste. "And people willingly chose to live there?" he blurted. Hooper chuckled. "I sure as hell didn't," he said. "That blame is squarely on my folks. But even with that mistake, I have some fond memories of the place. One of which was playing out on the coastline as the snow would come down. There weren't many kids up there in the off-season, but whenever it would snow, the ones who were there would come down to this old ship that was docked in the bay. We'd pick sides and have half an hour to fortify our lines and make ammo before the battle would commence." He sighed and smiled. "Had some good wars up there." "Sounds like a lot more fun than what we're walking into," DeVille muttered. "Well, you said you needed to be stealthy," Hooper said with a shrug. "Make a few snowballs and send them flying." The corporal groaned, but couldn't hold back his smile as he shook his head. 2 minutes to target," a voice came over the radio. "Repeat, 2 minutes to target." "That's our cue," Hooper said, and led DeVille towards the other men. "All right, get your gear and get ready to move," he bellowed. "This is going to be a long day, but we're going to get out there and make things happen. Move like you got a purpose." Everybody in the cutter started getting their gear and working their way up to the deck. As they emerged, the snow pelted their faces as they looked across to the other ship. "DeVille," Hooper said, waving for his companion. "Yeah, Cap?" the corporal asked. "Take your men and get on shore," Hooper instructed. Do a quick sweep of the landing zone and make sure we're alone." They looked to the beach landing zone, with trees about 30 yards from shore. "Yes, sir," DeVille replied. "And Corporal," Hooper added, "do it silently. Can't risk being overrun before we even begin." DeVille nodded and waved for his team to follow him. "My team, on me," he barked, and 9 men fell into line with him, filing into a waiting craft on the side of the cutter. Hooper clicked his communicator, clicking it to the everybody channel. "This is Captain Hooper," he said firmly. "We're about to land and get this mission underway. Until you receive the order to fire from me, we are under stealth protocols. Don't worry, though, you will have an opportunity to take the fight to the enemy. Everybody get ready to move on Corporal DeVille's signal." While the soldiers on the cutters got ready for battle, DeVille and his team of 10 were in a small craft headed to shore. "Owens, White," DeVille said. "As soon as we land, you take point with me, leave your gear and move quick. Get to within a few yards of the tree line and see what you see." "If there are hostiles?" Owens asked. The corporal nodded. "If it's manageable, take them out silently," he instructed. "Reinforcements won't be far behind." "And if it's not manageable?" White asked. DeVille jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "Haul ass back to the boat," he said. "And the rest of you, get the gear to shore and be ready to fight if need be." The men nodded as they got closer to shore. The noise from the engine was louder than any of them were comfortable with, but there was no other option for them, especially in this freezing weather. As they got within a few yards of shore, a handful of zombies emerged from the trees. The sailor slowed the boat, turning it to the side to come as close to a stop as it could in the water. "Go!" DeVille barked. He, Private White, and Private Owens leapt over the side, running hard with their knives drawn. The 4 ghouls on the shore saw them, letting out moans and shambling forward. There was a slight step down from the woods to the rocky sand-covered beach area, and a couple of the ghouls slipped on the snow-covered lip, tumbling to the ground. DeVille ran right up the middle towards one of the fallen zombies, with another one directly behind it. He jumped on top, pressing his boots into the ghoul's back, holding it down as he waited on the other one to get closer. As soon as it was within reach, he stabbed it in the head, spinning it to the ground and on top of the one he was holding down. He quickly pulled the knife out and jammed it into the side of the other creature's skull. DeVille looked to either side, seeing White and Owens had taken out their own creatures. The 3 of them exchanged pointed looks as moans erupted from inside the woods. The corporal motioned for them to inch closer, hoping to see what was coming their way without alerting the undead mob. As they grew closer, White engaged with a zombie that popped out, quickly stabbing it and tossing it aside. Before he could reset, 2 more came out. He didn't chance it, taking a few steps back, careful to avoid the lip separating the woods from the beach. This time, however, the zombies managed to navigate it, so White delivered a forceful front kick, sending one back into the other, both to the ground. He quickly jumped on top, stabbing furiously until both stopped moving. DeVille was hopeful they could manage it, but his heart sank when the moans intensified. He gazed into the trees, spotting movement everywhere he looked. "Shit," he muttered, and turned around, letting out a panicked whistle to the other men and motioning for them to hurry up. The rest of the troops reacted to the urgency in his movements, dropping the gear on the beach and coming running. As they reached the dip, the onslaught began. A few dozen ghouls poured out of the woods, attracted by the others' moans. "Two-man teams, go!" DeVille barked. The soldiers broke into pairs, with one at the front and the other just behind. The lead man would grab a zombie, spinning them around to face the one coming in. They'd jam a blade into the back of its head and shove it forward, knocking some of the creatures back. This maneuver was one the troops had been taught in Seattle and worked effectively here, though the fighting was intense. The group tried everything they could to keep the battle contained to the lip of the beach, but it became evident rather quickly that it wasn't going to last. "Fall back to the beach," DeVille bellowed, afraid that they would be overrun. "Spread them out!" Every man gave one more shove to the zombies in their control before retreating. They formed a single line, putting 5 yards or so between each of them.
This spread the ghouls out a bit, although not evenly. Some men only had one coming at them, while others had three. The soldiers with single zombies stabbed theirs and immediately flanked the others, who were being held up with the same flip-and-hold strategy. It didn't take long for the flanking soldiers to take out the ghouls with jabs to the backs of their heads that they didn't see coming. Soon the shore was littered with corpses and soldiers breathing heavily. "Is everybody good?" DeVille asked, looking around. The soldiers called back in the affirmative as they did their duty of walking around to make sure that all the corpses were properly dead. "Good," DeVille said. "White, Owens, keep an eye on the tree line and make sure that's all of them. The rest of you, get geared up. We have us a town to clear." Chapter 4. Hooper led his group along the coast up to the warehouse, taking the scenic route to avoid the downtown area. A few men walked up ahead, patrolling the tree line and dispatching a few zombies lumbering out here and there. Hooper walked in front of the group, studying the map and trying to figure out exactly where they were. He glanced at the young private next to him. "It's Walls, right?" he asked. The private nodded, his thick neck barely moving with the motion. "Yes, sir," he replied. Hooper pursed his lips as he studied him. "You came on board with this squad, he snapped his fingers, in the Monroe assault." "Just after that, sir," Walls replied. "Caught up with your team outside of Maltby, a few miles to the west." The captain nodded. "A lot closer than I thought I was going to get," he admitted. "Hope you don't take it personally. The last couple weeks have been an absolute madhouse." "No offense taken, sir," Walls assured him. "The last month and a half have been a madhouse. The last couple of weeks just amped it up like one of my old house parties." Hooper chuckled. "Partier, huh?" he asked, cocking a brow. "I'm a firm believer in work hard and play hard, sir," Walls replied with a smirk. "Be careful what you wish for, son," Hooper said, shaking his head. "Because if we survive this, then you're in charge of the after-party." Walls grinned. "Yes, sir," he replied. A 20-something private ran towards them from up ahead and didn't break stride as a couple of zombies on the beach wandered up towards him. He deftly moved to the side, avoiding them gracefully. "That's a man on a mission right there," Walls quipped. "You're more right than you know, soldier," Hooper replied. The private slowed to a brisk stride as he approached the captain, and then turned and joined their pace. "What did you find, Stewart?" Hooper asked as the younger man fell into step with them. "We have about another half-mile up before the road cuts over to the warehouse," the private replied. "Resistance?" Hooper asked. Stewart pointed to the zombies he'd dodged that were now being struck down by other team members. "Just a few stragglers like that on the beach," he explained. "Once we hit the road, it becomes a bit more treacherous." "Guns a-blazing treacherous?" Hooper asked. Stewart shook his head. "Not with this level of manpower," he replied. "Going to be slow going for a few blocks, but they can be taken out silently, which is more than I can say about the target itself." "As advertised?" the captain asked. Stewart shook his head again. "If anything, they undersold it," he said with a sigh. "Easily a couple thousand, maybe even approaching 3. Hooper nodded slowly. "Entry point?" he asked. "I found a loading dock door that is halfway open," the private explained. "It's high enough off of the ground that those things can't get inside, but low enough that we should be able to get inside with a little work." "How little?" Hooper cocked a brow. Stewart tilted his head back and forth. "Pretty sure Walls and myself won't have any issues," he said slowly, trailing off and glancing back towards Private Olson, one of the men in the truck brigade. Olson, though in his mid-20s and a soldier, was a bit on the pudgier side, as were quite a few of the trucker team. "Some of the men might need a helping hand," Stewart explained. "Not especially time-consuming, but something we need to account for." "What's the situation in front of the entry point?" Hooper asked. Stewart sighed. "I wish I could say it was good," he admitted. "But it's packed. Thankfully, it's on the corner of the building and the bulk of the ghouls are near the center. Still, they're pressed up against the wall and back about 30 deep." The captain continued to walk silently, thinking hard about what could be the proper play for them. "Is there a position to the side we can take without attracting attention?" he finally asked. "I believe so, sir," Stewart replied. "There is a row of small business buildings across the street from that side of the warehouse. Only downside is that there's a tall chain-link fence cutting it off from the road."
"Were there any cars in the parking lots of those businesses?" Hooper asked.
The private nodded. "Yes, sir, a couple," he replied.
"Good. We can use those to push through the fence," Hooper said.
Walls furrowed his brow. "Won't the noise give us away before we're ready?" he asked. The captain shook his head. "We have 30 strong," he paused, glancing back at Olson. "We have nearly 30 strong men with us. We'll just pop it into neutral and give them a push." "Couldn't hurt to have that as cover too," Stewart added. "Just push them into the crowd near the opening."
"Sounds like a plan," Hooper agreed, and turned towards his men.
"Okay, men, listen up," he called. "We are about to be up against it. Nobody fires until we are damn good and ready. We're moving up several blocks and taking refuge behind some buildings. Resistance is going to be stiff but manageable. Blades out, work as a team, and we'll get through it. Understood?" There was a chorus in the affirmative, and Hooper raised a fist. "All right, let's get this done," he barked. Everyone drew their knives, with a few men pulling out machetes for that extra bit of reach. They picked up the pace a bit as they moved down the beach, ready for battle. "Truck drivers, make your way towards the back of the line," Hooper instructed. "For the moment, you are to be protected since you're the only ones who can drive us out of here. The rest of you, keep an eye on them." The captain, Stewart, and Walls were the first ones to the road, a small parking lot with beach access. There were 8 zombies milling about, slowly shambling towards the beach, still reacting to Stewart running by earlier. The 2 privates jumped into action, darting forward and delivering kill strikes as several of their comrades joined in the fight. Hooper rushed forward with a few men behind him, taking on a group of 10 zombies in the road. The captain jammed his blade forward into the back of a head before shoving the ghoul into the others, knocking them to the ground and staggering others. The men who flanked him quickly rushed in and stabbed away, ending the threat. The soldiers attacked in waves, with Hooper at the forefront, Walls and Stewart by his side leading the charge. When they reached the end of the first block, they could see a few dozen more zombies on the next block ahead, and a few blocks on the other side of that, they could see the parking lot of the warehouse. "Where to now?" Hooper asked, glancing over at Stewart. The private in question motioned with his hand. "If we cut to the north 3 blocks, we'll be behind those buildings for cover," he explained. They looked up the road to see minimal resistance, only about 10 zombies stretched over the next 2 blocks. "Double time it, men. Let's move," Hooper instructed. The troops moved rapidly up the road, bowling through the minimal resistance as they tried to get to the other side of the warehouse. They made the turn towards the buildings, seeing several zombies in the way, but made quick work of them. "Any of those buildings clear?" Hooper asked. Stewart nodded. "Yes, sir. Clothing store in the middle of the complex," he replied. "I got inside to get a better look, and it was clear. Front door is open." "Lead the way," Hooper replied. Stewart led the men up to the building, a strip mall with several stores and restaurants, opening it up and doing a quick sweep of the room to make sure it was clear. All the soldiers eventually made their way inside and secured the door behind them. The front of the building faced the warehouse, and most of the men walked over to the window, looking out. Audible gasps rippled through them when they saw what they were up against. Thousands of zombies stretched the entire length of the building, 20 or even 30 deep in some spots. "There's the entry point," Stewart said, pointing towards the open bay door, about head height off of the ground. Tons of zombies milled about in front of it, trying to get in. It was about 100 yards from the edge of the lot where the fence was. Hooper looked outside to the parking lot, spotting 2 sedans and nothing more. Walls sidled up next to him, letting out a low whistle. "Always wondered what running into the mouth of hell would be like," he muttered. "We faced worse during the Seattle offensive," Hooper pointed out. "Yeah, when we had 10 times as many troops by our side," Walls muttered. Stewart approached, waving a hand around his head. "Doors are secured, and doesn't look like anything followed us," he reported. "We should have free rein to do what we need to do." "Good," Hooper replied, and studied the situation for a few moments. He knew he had to come up with a battle plan on the fly. The crowd of zombies by the entry point was a little more than he'd anticipated, to say the least. "Walls, Stewart, get a squad of 5 together to be the tip of the spear," he finally instructed. "If that door is open, there's a chance we're going to have hostiles inside." "You think zombies could have climbed up?" Walls asked. Hooper shook his head. "With a crowd that size, it's possible they followed someone into the building," he explained. "With an open door like that, whoever they followed may not have lived long enough to close it." "Prepare for the worst, hope for the best," Stewart agreed. "I'm tracking." "Get your team ready," Hooper instructed, and then surveyed the rest of the men who were milling about, talking quietly to themselves. "All right, listen up," he bellowed. "We're about to make this assault, and it's going to be a beast." He began pointing at different men as he barked instructions. "You 3 and you 3 are on car duty. You're leading the charge through the fence. Once through, I want one team to steer towards the entrance, picking up enough speed to get the vehicle clear of the entry point. The other team, I want you to aim for the center mass on the horde. Pick up as much speed as you can and let it plow through. We're far enough away from the trucks that there isn't a risk of hitting them." The soldiers in question responded in the affirmative, and Hooper turned to the rest of the men. "I need 6 shooters who can do it on the run, with 8 more backing them up," he declared. 14 men stepped forward, but he raised a hand. "If you're a truck driver, take a step back," Hooper said. 3 men did so, leaving 11 soldiers. "I can work with that," the captain said. "I'll be the 12th. When we get to the entry point, it's going to be a shit show with the world bearing down on us. I need headshots, rapidly. First team steps up, unloads a mag, then second team steps up while you reload. You hold the line as long as you can, to give us a chance at getting inside. The first team, which I'm going to lead, fires 2 mags. Second team, you unload yours, then get your asses inside and provide cover. We won't be far behind." The group responded in the affirmative, emphatic and psyching themselves up, and everyone got into position. Hooper took a few steadying breaths and checked his assault rifle to make sure it was ready. He glanced over at the rest of his men who were battle-hardened and ready for another fight. "Car teams, go!" Hooper barked. The 6 men in charge of the vehicle stepped outside the front door, quickly sweeping the area beside the store to make sure they were alone. They moved over to the cars, checking the door before smashing in the driver's side windows. Almost in unison, the soldiers reached inside and popped the cars into neutral before opening the doors and taking control of the steering wheels. "Breach team, go!" Hooper said as the cars began to pick up steam. The breach team headed out the door, 5 men led by Walls and Stewart, rushing out to take up position behind the car headed to the breach point. "Let's move!" Hooper barked at the remaining men and led them on a rush out of the building, running hard to catch up with the vehicles that were picking up steam. A moment later, the cars crashed through the chain-link fencing, ripping right through them. The metallic clatter on the ground echoed through the air, garnering the attention of a handful of zombies near the back of the mob. A few of them turned and started shambling towards the running soldiers. "Fuck, they're onto us," Stewart warned. "Just keep moving," Walls shot back, and both men got behind the lead car headed towards the opening, pushing it so that it picked up speed. The rest of their team was right behind them, aiming their weapons forward, ready to strike. More ghouls continued to peel off from the mob, alerted to the fresh meat headed their way. This worried Hooper, and he could already see this was going to be a problem. He motioned for a few men to get behind the car and push so that it would pick up more speed. "Get that thing moving!" he cried. As the men got to work, more zombies came off of the main horde and came their way, putting a good 5 yards of zombies between them and the beginning of the entry point. "Push harder!" Walls bellowed. The men behind the car headed towards the entrance, dug in deep, picking up as much speed as they could. A few moments later they smacked into the front edge of the mob. The momentum and weight of the vehicle was enough to plow right through the first few rows. As the soldiers watched the car plow into the mob, they quickly vanished behind the rotted flesh coming around it and opened fire. The men pushing the car took point, giving the breach team time to work. "Let's move!" Walls cried. He rushed over towards the entrance point, with several zombies in front of him. With close quarters, he drew his handgun, quickly aiming from target to target, dropping them one by one. Stewart and the other 3 men joined in, quickly clearing a path to the entrance. Walls rushed over, leaping up and sliding inside in a single motion. He quickly popped up, slinging his rifle to the ready position and scanning the immediate area. The warehouse was huge, stretching for as far as he could see, and it was dimly lit, with only the skylights providing illumination. Even with the dim lighting conditions, he could see down the main aisle running alongside the docks, and there was movement.
"What we got?"
Stewart asked.
"Movement straight ahead,"
Walls replied.
"Got it,"
Stewart replied as the other 3 soldiers entered from outside. The gunfire intensified from behind them, but they had to focus on the task at hand.
"Stewart and I will cover the front. You 3 keep an eye on the aisles,"
Walls instructed. The other 3 men nodded as one of them broke out a high-powered flashlight, getting it ready as they moved.
"You ready?"
Walls asked.
Stewart nodded. "Let's do it."
Walls and Stewart led the charge down the warehouse wall, rifles at the ready. The men behind them kept pace, shining the light down each aisle as they went, the light bouncing off of the tall metal racks of goods. They got a few rows deep when one of the soldiers let out a whistle, prompting them to stop. Stewart and Walls kept the rifle aimed ahead as a few shots popped off behind them, taking out shamblers.
"We're good,"
one of the soldiers called back. Stewart and Walls kept moving up, occasionally squeezing off a round or 2, taking down a zombie in front of them. They continued this pace for a minute or so, until they made it to the far wall of the building.
"I think we're good,"
Stewart said. Walls spotted a door about halfway down the wall and motioned towards it. They walked down and looked through the small glass window into an office area.
"Should we clear it?"
Stewart asked. Walls thought for a moment, looking behind them to the racks of goods, seeing some large boxes for computer desks.
"Give me a hand,"
he said. Stewart glanced over and realized what he was going for, and they grabbed one of the boxes, dropping it to the floor. Another pair of soldiers joined them, doing the same and setting their box on top.
"If there are zombies in there, they aren't getting through that,"
Walls said.
"At least not till well after we're on the road."
"Let's check the back wall and work our way back," Stewart suggested. The gunfire was intense outside, echoing through the building.
"Sounds like they have a hell of a fight on their hands out there,"
Stewart worried.
"They might need some help."
As the men inside did their sweep, the battle outside raged on. The second car slammed into the crowd of ghouls, rumbling over a couple dozen before coming to a stop. Hooper glanced over to his left, seeing Walls and Stewart slipping inside the warehouse.
"Open fire!"
Hooper barked. He stepped up with his fire team, unloading a torrent of bullets towards the marching horde. They do their best to aim carefully, but with that many zombies packed together, they know they'd hit a head somewhere along the line. The gunfire was near-deafening as the line unloaded on the ghouls, all while they slowly moved towards the entrance. They created a semicircle firing line, keeping the horde at bay as they shot and shot. The small group of men by the entrance fired as quickly as they could, some of them switching to 3-round burst mode. Hooper heard that as his team stepped back from the line to reload and his second team started up. The car didn't do as much as he'd hoped, and they were starting to get overrun, with zombies less than a yard away from them.
"Help them out!"
he bellowed, and broke away from formation with 3 other men, rushing towards the door and the men trying to defend it. They opened fire on the run, hitting several zombies as they went, giving the men some breathing room. As the second fire team depleted their magazines, they broke from the formation to find only a handful of men stepping up to take their place. They didn't hesitate, running towards the opening. They quickly jumped up and dove inside. One of the soldiers sprung to his feet, running over to the chain that controlled the metal door. He slung the rifle over his shoulder while leaping into the air, grabbing the chain several feet above the ground. His weight was enough to pull the door most of the way open quickly. As soon as he landed, he flipped his rifle back to the ready position, getting to the corner of the door and opening fire into the crowd coming near the soldiers still on the ground. 2 other soldiers joined him, picking off zombies a little bit further into the pack as the guys on the ground had the ones directly in front of them taken care of. This allowed the other soldiers time to break away from the far firing line, and rush over to the door. A few of the interior soldiers helped them up, getting them inside as the zombies started to push towards them.
"Get inside! Move!"
Hooper bellowed. He barked comments to the other men on his line to get inside, backing up along with them while firing. The bullets from inside continued to fly, picking off every zombie they could that was near the captain as he fought to hold back the crowd.
"Move it, Captain!"
a soldier screamed. Hooper glanced around, realizing he was the last one on the ground. He turned and ran for the door just as his men unleashed a torrent of bullets, whizzing just over his head to take down the threat behind him. He leapt up and immediately felt hands on his shoulders as his men pulled him inside.
"He's in!"
someone yelled, and the guns fell silent. For a moment, the only sounds were heavy breathing and the frustrated moans of the undead outside. After a beat, a few of the men helped their captain to his feet.
"Is everybody good?" he asked. "No bites?"
The men all looked around, checking each other, and soon everyone was declared clear.
"Hell yeah,"
Hooper said with a grin.
"Good work, men."
As they took a moment to catch their breath, Walls and his team approached from the back of the warehouse.
"Captain, good to see you're okay,"
Walls greeted.
"Same,"
Hooper replied with a smile. "How are we looking in here?" he asked.
"The aisles are clear,"
Walls replied, motioning with his hands as he turned towards the inside.
"We found some offices on the far end of the building. They aren't cleared, but we blocked it off so nothing is coming in from there."
Hooper nodded. "How is the inventory looking?" he asked.
"We didn't go down too far down the aisles, but from what we can tell, the shelves look full,"
Stewart replied.
"Best we could have hoped for,"
Hooper replied, and then faced his men.
"All right, everyone, you know what we need. Food above all else, bullets if you run across them. Fan out and find what we need. And open up some of those bay doors so we can get some light in here."
There was a chorus of "Yes, sir," and the men branched out. Hooper took a moment, standing near the door and looking down at the mob of ghouls that were trying to get inside.
"You almost got me," he murmured, "but not today."
The zombies moaned and reached up at him as he walked away to finish his mission. Chapter 5. DeVille led his small band of men through the woods towards the downtown area. There were a handful of straggler zombies around, which the men easily dispatched with knives as they went, silently so they didn't alert any others. The group continued to move up the woods, hearing the chorus of moans coming from the mob ahead. As they got closer to the edge of the trees, more zombies roamed around ahead. DeVille led the charge quickly, jamming knives into undead skulls, gently dropping the bodies to prevent more noise. Finally, the team got to the edge of the woods, taking a knee behind cover to assess the situation.
"That does not look like fun,"
White muttered.
Owens nodded. "How the hell are we supposed to deal with that, Corporal?"
he asked, gaping. DeVille stared out towards the center of town. Zombies were packed in everywhere. Hundreds of them clogged the intersection, scattered into parking lots and down side streets. They bounced off of one another, letting out angry groans as they did, like a feedback loop, keeping them all there.
"I'm open to suggestions, gentlemen," DeVille said.
"One thing's for sure," Owens declared. "We can't bring them this way. If we lured them into the woods, they'd be munching on us at the coast by the time we're done." White pointed down the road.
"Hey, Corporal, what about that place?" he asked.
DeVille followed his attention, looking at an apartment complex with a motorized gate. "What about it?" he asked, brow furrowing.
"Those complexes are usually like little neighborhoods," White explained. "Maybe we could pull them in there?"
Owens nodded slowly.
"I like that idea better than pulling them into the woods," he put in.
"Okay," DeVille said, drawing out the word in thought. "So we get them in there, then what? Not like the motorized gate is going to work."
"Those things usually have releases on them so you can open them manually," White replied.
Owens scoffed.
"Opening it isn't the issue, dumbass," he quipped. "What are we going to do once they're inside?"
"If we can pull enough of them off of the road and time it right, then it won't matter," White replied, rolling his eyes. "We don't have to permanently get them off of the road, just get them out of the way long enough for the convoy to come through, right, Corporal? DeVille nodded slowly. He's right, he agreed. We just need to make a window for the convoy to come through. A few of those things bouncing off the front of a semi isn't going to slow it down. So what's the plan then? Owens asked with a sigh. The corporal looked out and surveyed the landscape. There were a handful of zombies near the entrance of the apartment complex, with some movement happening inside, but it was minimal. The walls around were about 8 feet high, but they were made of brick with several openings large enough to see through. We should be able to get over the wall without too much trouble, DeVille said. My concern is that we won't be able to draw them all inside the complex. Divide and conquer? White asked. The corporal nodded. I'll lead a team into the complex and pull as many as we can in there, he said. Owens, I want you to keep a team here in the woods. If the convoy is coming through and too many of those things don't take our bait, it'll be up to you to get them out of the road any way you can. I'll take care of it, Owens promised. White, let's move out, DeVille said, and he broke from the hiding spot. The corporal tapped 3 other men as they went, breaking the group into 2 teams of 5. They worked their way a couple of blocks to the south, away from downtown, staying as quiet as they could while moving through the woods. DeVille led his team to the edge of the woods, a couple of blocks south of the apartment complex. They looked up towards it, seeing a couple dozen zombies in the road and a row of houses on the street. Okay, here's the plan, he said quietly to his team. We're getting across the street using their houses for cover, then getting over that fence. Once we're inside the complex, take out any immediate resistance without making noise. Then get to the front gate. Why can't we make noise? One of the soldiers asked. Shouldn't the walls muffle the sound enough that the interstate group won't hear? I'm more concerned with the zombies by the gate, the corporal explained. We make too much noise and they'll be on us, making it impossible to get that thing open. The soldier thought about it for a moment before nodding in agreement. DeVille looked back to the road, seeing the zombies just aimlessly milling about. Let's move, he instructed, and led the group out from behind cover. He moved swiftly across the road and into the row of houses, 2 back to back, each facing their own road. He got a few houses deep from the road for more cover and checked the alleys between them for undead. At the 3rd house he made the turn, finally finding a straight shot to the apartment complex wall. They moved quickly, meeting no resistance. The team stopped at the house before the complex, checking out the wall. Straight ahead, no more than 20 yards from them, was the cutout in the wall with ornamental metal installed. While the design choice was questionable from an aesthetic point of view, the utility purpose to help them over the wall was unquestioned. DeVille looked both ways down the road, with only a couple of zombies at either end, unaware of their presence. He made the motion for the men to follow. DeVille led the charge, the group walking at a mall walker's pace to prevent unnecessary noise on the asphalt. As soon as they hit grass again, he darted over to the wall, leaping up and putting his foot in the hole that was a few feet off of the ground. He used it to boost himself up to the top of the wall before flipping himself over. He landed with a thud on his feet, stumbling a bit. Almost immediately, moans and footsteps echoed, and he quickly pulled out his knife, just as a zombie came at him from around a tree that was a few yards away. DeVille jammed the blade into the creature's skull from underneath its chin. As he threw it to the ground in a heap, more moans echoed. "Shit," the corporal muttered. White landed, and DeVille motioned for him to pull out his knife. He pointed to his ears and then out towards the other side of the breezeway to signal him to listen hard. The private nodded, and the 2 of them moved slowly towards the back of the closest building as the others hopped over the wall. They reached the back of the building and looked out towards the parking lot in front of the building through the breezeway. Several zombies shambled by, but the soldiers stayed put, waiting for the rest of the team to join them. When everyone showed up, DeVille silently motioned for them to follow. The 5 men, knives drawn, moved cautiously through the breezeway. As they got halfway up, a concrete staircase came into view to their left. The corporal moved around it, looking up and seeing no movement. "White, check it out," he whispered, motioning to the stairs. The private nodded and quietly moved up the stairs to the landing as DeVille and the others waited, on high alert. White checked out the large empty landing and then crept back downstairs. "We're clear up here," he said quietly. DeVille thought for a moment before putting a finger up to signal for the others to wait. He slowly moved towards the edge of the breezeway, looking out at the 60 or so zombies in the immediate parking lot. He let out a deep sigh, knowing that this was going to be a hell of a battle if they were going to clear it out enough to get to the gate. There weren't too many zombies near the breezeway, only 3 or 4 within a few yards and none facing him. Parked directly in front of the breezeway, however, was a groundskeeping truck. In the back lay a collection of shovels, rakes, and other maintenance tools. DeVille moved back towards the others, keeping his voice low. "I got a plan, but it's not very good," he whispered. "At least you're honest about it, Corporal," White replied. "White, you're with me," DeVille said. "We're going to get out to that truck and get the long tools out of it." The private cocked a brow. "Fighting with reach? I'm okay with that," he agreed. "How many of those things do we have to deal with?" "There are 50, 60 of those bastards in the lot there," DeVille replied. The soldiers all went pale, knowing that it was detrimental to not make any noise. Hand to hand was going to be the only way to go. "I gotta admit," a young private said, raising his hand, "I don't like those odds." "That's why we're going to use the terrain to even those odds," DeVille explained, pointing to the stairs. The men relaxed, smiles growing on their faces as they figured out what he was suggesting. "Not bad, Corporal," White said. "Not bad." DeVille motioned to various soldiers as he spoke. "You 3, get upstairs," he instructed. "White and I will be right back." The men complied and quietly went up the stairs as White and DeVille headed to the far end of the breezeway. They paused so they could take stock of the situation. "Hit and run?" White asked. DeVille nodded. "Hit and run," he replied. The 2 soldiers burst out from behind cover, running as hard as they could to the truck. The noise they generated was enough to get the attention of the nearby zombies, who went from milling about to intensely focused almost immediately. The soldiers didn't worry about them, instead focusing on getting to the truck. They grabbed every long tool they could, cradling them in their arms before turning and rushing back to the breezeway. White got ahead of DeVille, running hard up the stairs and dropping his haul off to the others. The corporal paused at the base of the stairs, seeing that they'd only managed to get half a dozen or so of the creatures to follow them. DeVille shuffled the tools in his arms, pulling out a metal rake and slamming it down hard on the railing. The metal-on-metal sound reverberated through the air and into the parking lot. The hum died down and was immediately replaced by a loud chorus of moans. "There we go," he muttered, and then ran upstairs. He dropped his goods on the ground, and the men sorted through them, grabbing shovels, a pitchfork, planting tools, and a variety of hoes and rakes. "Not exactly prime weapons," White quipped. DeVille picked up the pitchfork with a raised eyebrow. "Okay, well, that one is, obviously," White scoffed. "But the rest?" "Don't need them to be," DeVille replied. "Just need the reach to keep them at bay and knock them back. Let gravity and concrete do the heavy lifting for us." The private nodded in a begrudging agreement as the rest of the men picked up weapons. "I'm taking position by the railing," DeVille declared. "The rest of you line up and knock them back. Go in shifts to make sure you don't knock each other out." The corporal lined up with White and another soldier, waiting on the ghouls to get to the stairs. They let out whistles and catcalls to get their attention, and soon the zombies shambled towards them. As the first creature reached them, White delivered a headshot with the shovel, caving in the top of its head and sending the beast tumbling back. It knocked into another zombie, which cracked its skull on the concrete stairs. DeVille, on the other hand, stabbed the ghoul closest to him in the chest with his pitchfork, and then swung it over the railing. The zombie tumbled down to the concrete below, landing with a satisfying smack. "Holy shit! This might actually work," White said. The men started to get excited until a few dozen zombies came towards the stairs. They steadied themselves, waiting for the onslaught to begin. The first wave of ghouls started to come up the stairs, and DeVille's eyes widened. "White, switch places with me," he said quickly. The corporal reached the wall, taking a few steps down. He readied himself as the mob quickly came upstairs. They were packed tight, shoulder to shoulder, 3 across as they came up. When they got close, DeVille stabbed the one in front of him in the chest and flung it with everything he had towards the railing. He was able to generate enough force that the other 2 smacked into the railing as well. The one closest flipped over, but the next one fell back into the crowd, sending several back onto the stairs. The corporal let out a grunt as he wrestled the stabbed one over the railing before retreating. White and a soldier stepped up, swinging their tools hard, cracking skulls and sending bodies to the ground. As they stepped back, the other 2 came up, putting tools into zombie chests and pushing them backwards. It was a domino effect as they fell down the stairs, breaking the group up a bit. With the herd thinned, the others stepped up and continued cracking heads, with DeVille tossing a few over the side as they went. It was a tedious battle and exhausting since they didn't get a single reprieve, but ultimately they were able to take down the mob. The soldiers stood at the top of the stairs, catching their breath as they looked out at the carnage. Blood and corpses were everywhere, with a few severely broken ghouls still twitching on the stairs. "Watch your step going down," DeVille instructed, and the group carefully followed him down to the first floor. They moved around the ghouls, stabbing a few that could still be a threat with their mouths exposed. They stepped out of the breezeway and into the apartment complex. It was fairly large, about 10 buildings, with trees and green space in the center of the parking lot. There were about a dozen more zombies near the far side of the lot who didn't get caught up in the battle. "Okay, let's clear them out and get up to the gate," DeVille said. "We have a horde to attract." The group moved up towards the fence, quietly dispatching any zombie that got in their way. They were so spread out that it was no big deal. Finally, they were at the gate, staying out of sight except for White and DeVille, who went up to the motor that controlled the chain opening the gate. White knelt down to inspect it. "Can you get it open?" DeVille asked. The private nodded. "Yeah, shouldn't be a big deal," he replied, and pulled on the outer casing of the motor. It was secured with bolts, however, and he struggled with it for a moment before looking around the outside of it in a bit of a panic. "Problems, White?" DeVille asked. "No," White grunted. "I mean, kind of." DeVille cocked a brow. "Kind of?" he prompted. "I know the manual release is on the motor," the private insisted, "but we just have to get this casing off first." DeVille sighed. "What do you need, and how much time is it going to take?" he asked. "There were tools in that truck, right?" White asked. "Gotta be something that can get me in there. Shouldn't be more than a half hour or so?" He winced. DeVille let out a grunt, clicking on his communicator. "Owens, do you copy?" he asked. "Loud and clear, Corporal," Owens replied. "Good. We've hit a bit of a snag, and going to be a half hour or so before we can get this thing open," DeVille explained. "How's it looking out there?" "Same as when you left," Owens replied. "Small crowd by you, downtown still packed." The corporal nodded sharply. "Good. Hang tight," he instructed. "Out." He clicked off his communicator and glanced over at White. "Come on, let's get you what you need. That gate has to get open." Chapter 6. About 45 minutes have passed since Captain Hooper and his men made it into the warehouse. They had been moving frantically, trying to get the trucks loaded up with food and a few pallets of bullets. Hooper worked with one of the soldiers, grabbing pallets of rice off of the floor with a pallet jack and wheeling it towards a truck. "There you go, soldier," the captain said. "Easy, easy. All right, we're clear. Get that to the truck." "Yes, sir," the soldier said, and headed off with the goods. Private Olson approached, so casually that the captain growled in frustration. "Private, why aren't you loading trucks?" he snapped. "We're on a timeline." "I understand that, sir," Olson replied. Hooper threw up his hands. "Well, if you understand it, then why are you standing in front of me without anything to move this food?" he demanded. "Because I noticed a major problem and thought you should know about it," Olson asked, a bit sheepish as he shrank away from the captain. Hooper took a moment to draw in a deep breath and calm down. This private was someone who hadn't done much more than drive trucks stateside, let alone seen combat. He was practically pissing himself, intimidated by his fiery superior. "I'm sorry, Olson," Hooper said with a sigh. "Sometimes I forget that everybody in my command hasn't seen combat and doesn't have the same sense of urgency as I do. Let me try that again." He took a deep breath. "What's the problem?" The private wrinkled his nose. "It's going to be easier to explain if I show you," he said. Hooper sighed again, glancing over to a couple of soldiers coming up the aisle with pallet jacks, and motioned to the pallets of rice next to him. "These two right here," he called. "And double-check, but I think it stretches into the next cutout area as well. I'll be right back." The soldiers got to work, and Hooper gestured for Olson to lead the way, starting off at a brisk pace. "I'm all yours, Private, but do make it quick," he said. Olson nodded jerkily. "Yes, sir," he said, hurrying quickly up the long aisle towards the trucks. After a decidedly uncomfortable silence, he finally spoke up. "I'm sorry that I'm not as seasoned as the rest of your men, but I promise you that I'm very good at driving trucks." "I'm glad to hear that, soldier," Hooper said as gently as he could muster. "We all have our role to play, and we're all counting on you to do just that." He kept his voice positive and optimistic, knowing that the young private was in way over his head and hoped that building him up was the best course of action. They emerged from the aisle, and Olson led him over to an open bay with the door wide open. The trucks were all to their left, being loaded up. They glanced over as they went, seeing that the trucks were 80% of the way there. "So, lay it on me," Hooper finally said. "What's the problem?" The private took a deep breath. "The good news is we were able to get into the cab by using an emergency hatch on the top of the trailers," he explained. "All of them have enough fuel to get us back to Seattle, and the batteries are still good. We didn't try to start them up, not wanting to rile up the zombies outside." "Okay," Hooper replied, drawing out the word expectantly. "So, what's the problem?" Olson pointed to the front of the trucks, where the zombies had started to congregate. They'd moved away from the front of the buildings and over to the truck cabs. "When my drivers got into the cabs, it attracted a lot of attention," he explained. "We were able to sneak back inside, but they just stayed there." Hooper shrugged. "So, can't we just run them over?" he asked. Olson shook his head. "If we hit a zombie, or even a small zombie, going 45 miles an hour, it's going to bounce off of the front grille like a rubber ball on concrete," he replied. "They're going to go flying. Going from a standstill to moving is going to run the risk of them getting caught in the wheel wells." Hooper pursed his lips, dread settling over him. "Okay," he finally said, crossing his arms. "So can't we just lure them away, get at the far end of the building and make some noise? Wouldn't that give you enough time to pick up speed?" "For a few trucks, maybe," Olson replied with a shrug. "But the lot is so narrow that we're going to have to leave one at a time, which is problematic to say the least." Hooper took a deep breath. "And no matter how much noise we make, as soon as those trucks start back up, they'll be headed that way," he finished, realizing what the young private was getting at. "Maybe we'll get lucky and have a solid start for all the trucks, and we can get out of here before they move over, but I wouldn't count on it," Olson continued. "These trucks have been sitting idle for at least 5 weeks. They are going to be moving slow out of the gate." Hooper sucked in his cheeks and then let them go. "So, not only do we have to move them, we either have to get them way out from here or kill them," he said. "At least a significant portion of them, yes," Olson confirmed. The captain sighed and then extended his hand to shake. "You did really good, Private," he commended as they shook. "I'll make sure you and your men have the time you need to get moving." Olson's eyes lit up at the praise, and then he headed off to continue his job. Hooper stared after him for a moment, and then clicked on his communicator. "Walls, Stewart," he said. "Get to Base 7 right now." 2 responses in the affirmative came through over the speaker, and he stared outside as he waited, trying to figure out how to make this work. He studied the threat vehemently until 2 sets of footsteps approached.
"Yes, sir?"
Walls asked. Hooper turned to face the duo and raised his chin.
"I have a mission for the 2 of you," he said.
"What can we do, Captain?" Stewart asked, cocking his head. Hooper pointed outside to the zombies.
"We have to figure out a way to take out that mob," he said.
Stewart and Walls looked at the mob, then at each other, and then at him with confused and concerned eyes.
"With all due respect, sir,"
Walls quipped.
"What?"
"Our truck drivers need time to be able to get rolling without worrying about zombies getting caught in the wheel wells," Hooper explained.
"We need to figure out how to make that happen."
Stewart sighed heavily.
"Fuck if I know, Captain," he groaned.
"Not the answer I was looking for, soldier," Hooper said.
"Would a bonfire work, sir?"
Walls suggested. The captain tilted his head back and forth thoughtfully.
"Going to have to be a big damn bonfire," he said.
"Follow me," Walls said, and led the other 2 down an empty aisle. The shelves were stacked full with goods, and he scanned the pallets as they walked.
"Here we go,"
he finally said, and pulled out his knife, cutting into the plastic wrap. He pulled out a bottle and tossed it to the captain. Hooper turned the bottle over in his hands and then grinned.
"That'll work,"
he said, nodding slowly as he studied the camping lantern oil.
"How exactly is that going to work?"
Stewart asked, raising a hand. "We have thousands of those things outside. How are we going to spray them down with this stuff?" Walls snorted.
"Water guns on aisle 6?"
he joked. "How about the store we came from?" Hooper suggested, and the privates exchanged a look and a shrug.
"Set them on fire as we walk?"
Stewart suggested. Walls nodded, picking up what he was putting down.
"Get them inside and torch the building," he finished.
"And the fire will keep them occupied and pull more over there," Stewart added. "The street was pretty clear on the other side, too," Walls said. "We should be able to hightail it the few blocks around the warehouse to get picked up." Hooper nodded, waving a hand above his head.
"Get prepped, because you go when we get the trucks loaded up," he instructed.
And they nodded, hacking away at the pallets to extricate bottles of camping oil. 5 minutes later, Walls and Stewart stood by an employee exit door at the far end of the warehouse. They peeked out, and there thankfully weren't any zombies immediately by the door.
"Okay, Walls, Stewart, you're on."
Hooper's voice came quietly through the communicator.
"When you see that last truck pull out, you get a move on to the rendezvous point. Do whatever you need to do to keep those things occupied."
"Yes, sir," Walls replied through the comm, and both men took a beat to check their inventory. They each had a backpack filled with large plastic bottles of camping lamp oil and several boxes of waterproof matches, as well as their guns.
"You ready?"
Stewart asked.
Walls shook his head.
"Not really," he said with a sigh.
"Don't worry, we'll be fine,"
Stewart replied, and smacked his companion on the back.
"Just keep a good distance, spray them down, and toss matches at them until they go up."
"How far are we really going to be able to spray this stuff?" Walls asked, cocking a brow. Stewart pulled out one of his bottles, clicked open the top, and gave it a good squeeze. The pressure sent out a stream of flammable liquid about 10 yards away, splashing on the floor. Walls nodded, his shoulders relaxing a bit.
"These matches are going to stay lit no matter what," Stewart explained.
"You can light them and dunk them under water, and they'd still burn. Once your fire gets going, douse them." Walls nodded sharply and took a deep breath.
"All right, let's do this," he said.
Stewart gently opened the door, and the duo crept outside. Moans erupted from around the corner, even though they were a good 30 yards away. The downed fence was to their right, with nothing between them and the strip mall building. When they reached the corner of the warehouse, they could see the agitated zombie mob was still 15 yards away.
"We're in position,"
Stewart murmured into the communicator.
"Get those trucks started up."
One by one, the vehicles on the other side of the building roared to life, filling the air with a satisfying rumble. The zombies immediately turned their attention towards the noise, pushing in that direction.
"Let's do it,"
Stewart barked. The duo came out from hiding, bottles in each hand. They ran up to the zombies whose backs were turned and started dousing them with oil. They sprayed nearly a gallon of the flammable liquid over several yards of rotting flesh before tripping the tops off of the bottles and tossing the near-empty bottles into the horde. Just as some of the zombies began to turn, the soldiers lit up matches and tossed them in. It took a few tosses before one of the zombies lit up, but once the fire started, it quickly spread to the others nearby. Once that happened, some of the crowd turned towards it, but the majority continued to focus on the trucks. "We have to get their attention," Stewart cried. Wall shrugged. "Guns?" he asked. Stewart shrugged too, and then they both pulled out their handguns, firing several rounds rapidly, making as much noise as they could as they took out a few zombies in the process. This got the attention of quite a few of the ghouls, reaching most of the way to the trucks. They holstered their weapons, pulling out more bottles and continuing to douse the undead. A couple of the flaming ghouls were still shambling, so when the liquid hit them, it immediately went up, making it easier to spread the fire to others. The soldiers continued to backpedal, luring the creatures towards the fence. It was a slow walk, but they continued to spray them as they approached. Stewart looked over the heads of the mob, finding that they were pulling the majority of the zombies away from the trucks, but some still remained. "When I give the signal, I want you both to open fire," Hooper's voice came through the communicator. "Empty a mag. We need a diversion." "Copy that, Cap," Walls replied, and the soldiers continued to spray the zombies while also peering over the mob. A few of their fellow soldiers climbed out of a cab onto the top of a truck, aiming down at the zombies in front of the transports. "Now!" Hooper cried, and the soldiers opened fire. They used their rifles and fired into the horde, hoping to do some damage and not have to waste too many bullets. At the same time, the truck soldiers followed suit, the dueling gunfire cancelling each other out. Stewart and Walls continued to backpedal as they fired, being careful not to shoot the flaming zombies nor the trucks behind. After they each depleted a magazine, they reloaded and slung the rifles back over their backs, going back to frying the ghouls. Walls peeked over the crowd as they sprayed down the next batch of zombies, and the soldiers on the trucks were climbing back into the cab. As the trucks began to move and pull out, they rattled a little from being stationary for so long, and also running over a few corpses on the ground. "Looks like it's working," he cried, pumping a fist into the air. "Great. Now we just have to hold their attention," Stewart quipped. The duo sprayed another bottle each and then tossed them into the crowd, which had a significant amount of flames going. 100 or so zombies were on fire, most still staggering, but some on the ground, causing pile-ups behind them and setting even more on fire. When the soldiers reached the fence, they looked back towards the store. "I'll keep them focused," Walls said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. "You go get those doors propped open." "On it," Stewart replied, and broke away, rushing over to the store. He threw the doors open and grabbed a heavy metal display rack, sliding it over and putting the leg against the door to hold it open. He did the same to the other side and then rushed back inside. He swiped his arm across a table near the back, throwing all the shirts to the floor. He tossed his bag on top, turning it over and emptying all the oil bottles, about a dozen in total. He quickly cracked them all open, grabbing a handful and running around the store, spraying everything he could. As he doused everything in oil, he looked outside, spotting Walls making a run for the door once he got to the parking lot. The zombie mob followed him, a couple thousand ghouls all focused on one fresh meal. He looked past him and saw the last of the truck starting to pull out. "Get your ass in here and douse some stuff," Stewart barked. "The trucks are out and we gotta move." Walls rushed to the table and dumped his bag out too, opening the bottles. The zombies were close behind, not leaving a lot of time, so they ripped the lids off and threw the bottles around the room, causing puddles of oil to form. Once the last one was open, the first few zombies reached the front door. The flaming ones weren't quite there yet, so the oil they spread wasn't in danger of going up just yet. "Let's just make sure they know we're here," Stewart said, and then let out a loud whistle. "Come get some barbecue!" Walls bellowed, and the two of them continued to hoot and holler, making sure the ghouls continued to filter in. It didn't take long for there to be over 100 ghouls packing their way into the store, others fighting to get inside. The zombie line outside spread from the door, pressing up against the glass, and it began to crack. At the sound of crinkling glass, Stuart grinned and pulled out his rifle. "What do you say we give them a hand?" he asked. Walls nodded, readying his own gun, and the two of them aimed towards the top of the windows on either side of the door. They fired a couple of times each, just enough to weaken the glass, enough for it to give way. After a horrific crash, it shattered, coming tumbling down and allowing zombies to pour in by the dozens, quickly filling the room to bursting. The lead ghouls were halfway in, shoving aside displays and knocking racks over. "You ready to light this candle?" Stuart asked. Walls nodded, and the two of them each took out a box of matches, lighting one and dropping it into its respective box. Just as the container started to ignite, they tossed them in different directions, sending the flaming sticks scattering across the room. Then they bolted. The store went up in flames. Between the oil and the clothing, it didn't take long for there to be a raging inferno. The soldiers stood outside for a moment, watching the ghouls inside vanish in a combination of raging fire and black smoke. "Come on," Walls finally said, tugging on Stuart's arm. "We gotta go hitch our ride." They looked down the road, finding it mostly empty. They started to jog, but Walls stopped short at the next storefront window, peering inside. "What is it?" Stuart asked when he realized his partner had stopped. Walls focused in on the wall that was shared by the clothing store, attaching it to a small diner, a greasy spoon-type place. "You think the grills in this place use natural gas?" he asked. Stuart's eyes widened as he peered inside, and when he spotted the grills, the two privates shared a concerned look before they both turned and sprinted away in a panic. "Move, move, move!" Stuart bellowed. They made it several blocks as the fire consumed the strip mall, spreading from business to business. They paused in the middle of the road to take a quick breather, doing a sweep to make sure they weren't alone. Walls glanced back over his shoulder. "Guess it wasn't natural gas," he said. As if on cue, a split second later, a horrific explosion racked the ground, and a giant fireball shot 50 yards into the air. The force of the blast nearly knocked the two of them to the ground, and their ears rang. Stuart blinked, shaking his head. "Guess it was," he quipped. "What in the holy hell was that?" Hooper cried over the communicator. "Are you two okay?" "We're fine, Cap," Stuart said quickly. "Apparently the diner next door kept our gas bill paid." "That's going to pull every zombie in a 5-mile radius our way," Hooper shot back. "Haul ass to the rendezvous. We gotta move." "On our way," Stuart confirmed. The duo shared a quick chuckle at the mess they created, high-fiving before taking off running. Chapter 7. "Uh-huh. Half an hour, huh?" DeVille asked. "I said probably," White muttered. "This thing is more complicated than I thought." The corporal sighed. "Are you sure it has a release?" he asked. "All of them do," White growled. "Last thing you want if you live in a gated community is getting trapped when the power goes out." "Let's hope you're right," DeVille said, "because if not, we're in trouble." White continued to mess with the box, a triumphant grin finally erupting on his face as he figured it out. He jammed a screwdriver into the mechanism, and there was a satisfying click. "Now we're cooking," White declared. He got up and moved over towards DeVille, who looked towards the gate. A couple of zombies in front of it that had been drawn over in the last little bit pressed against the gate, and it rocked back and forth a bit from their movement now that it was unlocked. "All right, let's throw this thing open," the corporal declared. The other 3 soldiers came out of hiding to join the men at the gate. "Okay, here's the plan," DeVille said. "We get this thing open, fire off a few rounds to take these down. Then I'll fire a few from the road to get the party started. We get out the way we came in, and hopefully clear enough out to get the trucks clear." The men nodded as a couple of the soldiers moved towards the back of the gate, ready to pull it open. DeVille gave the signal, and they pulled, quickly opening the large sliding piece of metal. The few zombies by the gate staggered as it opened, their arms sticking through the cracks and causing them to jerk to one side. As soon as they regained their footing, they were met with a handgun bullet to the face at nearly point-blank range. DeVille stepped out of the gate, firing a few more shots to take out the other stragglers near the front. He turned up towards the downtown area, seeing the mob of ghouls. He raised his gun and fired several times, which got the attention of the majority of them. "There you go. Come get me," DeVille said, staying in the road to give them a target to focus on as they lumbered down towards him. "Okay, guys, start working your way back through the complex," he bellowed. "This is going to be a slow-moving wave, but I don't want to take any chances." The men nodded and began to walk back. The corporal clicked on his communicator as the mob continued to shuffle towards him. "Owens, you seeing this?" he asked. "Yes, sir," came the reply. The corporal nodded. "I think we should be able to pull them in okay, but I need you to be on the lookout for stragglers," he instructed. "Don't want too many of them on the road for the convoy." "If there are stragglers, we'll take them out," Owens promised. "We have more than enough firepower over here." DeVille looked down and realized he didn't have a bag with him. "You have the explosives, don't you?" he asked dryly. "Yep," Owens replied, his voice a little amused. "Don't worry, I'm not going to use them unless absolutely necessary." The corporal nodded. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," he said. "Those things from the interstate would flood this area in short order." "Good to have the option in our back pockets, though," Owens said. "Well, that's true," DeVille agreed. "Okay, stay frosty." "Copy that," Owens replied. The corporal clicked the communicator off before switching frequencies. "Captain Hooper, you copy?" he asked. "How are we looking, Corporal?" Hooper asked. "About 10 minutes away from having the route clear," DeVille said. "That's good, because we're about to take off from here," the captain said. DeVille nodded. "We will meet you 3 blocks south of the downtown intersection for extraction," he said. "We'll have a truck waiting for you," Hooper promised. "See you soon, Captain," DeVille said, and the comm went silent as the zombies reached 20 yards off him. He began walking backwards into the complex, luring them along. "All right, let's get this done," he called. "Come on, you slow-moving bastards!" He continued to back up slowly, letting the ghouls come to him. When he was about 20 yards into the complex and the zombies were still following, they'd created a solid wall stretching to the entrance. "Owens, how's it looking from your end?" he asked into the communicator. "It's good, Corporal," Owens replied. "They're filing in like cattle." DeVille nodded. "Good to hear," he said. "Should have them backed in here before the convoy." A massive explosion to the north interrupted him, and he startled, staring north towards the factory. "What in the holy fuck is that?" he cried as a huge fireball and then smoke rose in the distance. He was stunned, blinking at the sky. "They're moving back out!" Owens cried through the communicator. "What?" DeVille barked. "They're going towards whatever the hell that explosion was," Owens said. The corporal grunted. "Shit," he muttered, and clicked over his communicator. "Captain, we have a problem. That explosion is pulling those things back into the road. Can you give us more time?" "Negative," Hooper replied. "That explosion is going to pull the zombies off of the interstate. If we don't get out now, I don't think we're going to." "Shit," DeVille cursed again. "I'll take care of it." He flicked his frequency over again. "Owens, we're going to try and get them back in here. If we don't, do whatever you can. That convoy is coming one way or the other." "Copy that," Owens replied. "The rest of you guys on me," DeVille cried. "We gotta light them up to keep them coming our way." "What about the interstate?" White asked. "They're coming this way regardless," DeVille replied. "Now do it!" All 5 men opened fire, hitting several zombies and dropping them. Some of the creatures continued pursuing them, however most of them were enthralled with the giant flickering light in the distance. "Owens, it doesn't look like we're having much impact," DeVille said. "I can see that, Corporal," the private barked. "It's up to you," DeVille said. "Pull them off the road. We'll come to support." "Copy that," Owens replied. Gunfire erupted from the woods as Owens and his team opened fire, and the corporal motioned for White and the others to follow him. They rushed through the complex towards where they'd come in, quickly hopping up over the wall and landing on the road. As they were scaling it, a giant explosion came from the woods. It was powerful enough to rattle the windows in the houses across the street from where they were.
Jesus Christ, Owens is getting after it,
White muttered. DeVille contemplated for a moment before issuing his orders.
Owens, do you copy?
He asked. There was no response, and his heart raced.
Owens, he cried, do you copy?
There was still no response, and White stiffened beside him.
That explosion may have knocked out his earpiece, he suggested.
DeVille motioned to the other 3 soldiers.
You 3, get to the rendezvous point,
he instructed.
But,
one of the soldiers stammered.
That's an order,
DeVille said.
White, you're with me. We're going to find Owens and the others.
We can help, the soldier insisted.
That explosion is going to pull that entire mob into the woods, the corporal snapped. The more of us in there, the more likely it is that shit's gonna go wrong. White and I can handle it. Now get moving.
The 3 soldiers nodded and rushed off to meet up with the convoy. DeVille and White started running towards the woods across the street. As they moved, another explosion racked the earth, this one larger than the first. When they reached the edge of the apartment complex wall, they glanced out and saw that the road was mostly clear, with only a few stragglers roaming about, not sure which way to go. The occasional gunshot popped off in the woods, but for the most part it was nothing but eerie moans.
Okay, listen. We get in there, find the others, and get the hell out, DeVille instructed. Try to use stealth kills if you can, because we're going to be surrounded. Lead the way, Corporal,
White said. Both men pulled out knives, keeping their handguns at the ready, as they rushed across the street and into the woods. DeVille tried his communicator one more time.
Owens, he said firmly, do you copy?
Still no response.
Damn it. Okay,
DeVille grunted, tightening his grip on his knife. Let's find them. He and White moved up through the woods, staying about 25 yards deep so they had cover from the road. The sunlight pierced through the trees, showing slow-moving ghouls in the distance. There was a smouldering crater about 30 yards in, where it looked like some high explosives went off. Trees were knocked over, zombies strewn about in pieces. However, there were 2 small groups congregating in different piles. DeVille's stomach flip-flopped, knowing that underneath those piles were most likely some of Owen's team. White tapped on his shoulder to bring him back to the moment, and the corporal nodded, focusing on the task at hand and moving through the woods. Ghouls still milled about everywhere, in all directions, creating a terrifying and deadly maze of rotten flesh. A couple wandered towards the duo, and the soldiers took cover behind 2 adjacent trees. They waited for the zombies to get within striking distance before popping out and striking. Both men delivered perfect headshots with their blades and let them fall to the ground. A gunshot went off in the distance, about 50 yards to the northwest, and both soldiers took off running in that direction, knowing that the zombies would be converging there. As they grew closer, DeVille could make out a body on the ground, and saw it was Owens, missing a chunk of his neck and not moving. He darted forward, but White grabbed his arm and pulled him back, shaking his head. Zombies descended on Owens, and the corporal shoved his feelings aside, letting White pull him behind a tree. They watched from behind a tree as Owens reanimated, and the zombies lost interest. Another couple of shots rang out to the west, causing the now undead soldier to sprint in that direction. DeVille's heart raced.
"There's a runner!" he bellowed in warning. "There's a runner!"
The duo rushed towards the gunfire, and as they moved, the other slow-moving zombies followed them, some branching off to pursue them, while others went straight for the cracking gunfire. A few more shots popped off, before silence, almost immediately followed by a scream that was then muffled. White grabbed DeVille and jerked him behind a tree.
"We have to get out of here, Corporal," he hissed.
DeVille shook his head vehemently.
"Not until we find the last man," he replied. "That was the last man," White replied. He went out screaming. No, the corporal insisted. We saw 2 piles. Owens and whoever that screamer was. That's 4. The private shook his head. Don't forget the smoking crater, he said. DeVille opened his mouth to argue, but then realized that White was probably right. He cursed under his breath, his heart sinking, and then moans way too close to them. Watch it, he cried, and shoved White out of the way, jamming his knife into a lunging ghoul's head. White turned and spotted 4 more creatures coming their way, and gave another one a kick to the chest, sending it tumbling back into its friends. As they engaged in the skirmish, trucks rolled by on the main road, which was now a couple 100 yards from their position. They looked back at the woods, now littered with zombies, so many that it would be suicide to try to get back to the road that way. Not to mention the risk of luring a runner towards the convoy. Captain, White and I aren't going to be able to get to the extraction point, DeVille said into his communicator. We have to get to the coast. They stabbed a few more zombies, backpedaling. Copy that, Corporal, Hooper said. I'll radio when I have a secondary pickup point. Thank you, Cap, DeVille said before grunting and kicking another ghoul. Good luck, Hooper said. The communicator went silent as DeVille and White delivered another death blow each. Before they could move, fast-moving steps pounded in their direction. The soldiers aimed their handguns in the direction of the runner, quickly taking aim and realizing it was zombified Owens. They fired several times as it approached, but the bullets missed its quick-moving head. DeVille dropped to one knee, sliding in front of White as the runner got close. He grabbed Owens by the shirt and yanked him down, sending him tumbling hard to the ground. As the zombie tried to scramble to its feet, White stepped up and unloaded the rest of his handgun magazine into the back of Owens's skull. He held out a hand to his corporal, breathing hard. You good? He asked. Yeah, now, come on, DeVille said, allowing himself to be helped up. Let's get to the coast. They took off running, trying to put as much distance between them and the zombies as possible, and especially between them and the potential runner before it reanimated. They finally made it to the coast, turning to the south and running for several more minutes before going to a slowish walk. They were out of breath, gasping for air but continuing to push forward. There was nothing but moderately snow-covered sand in front of them for as far as their eyes could see. DeVille had a defeated look on his face, and White put a hand on his shoulder. They laid down their lives to help save the community, he said earnestly. The corporal didn't meet his gaze. I know, he said in a curt tone. You didn't do anything wrong, Corporal, White insisted. I know, DeVille replied. White took a deep breath. Corporal, Private, I don't need a pep talk, DeVille growled. I know what happened, and it was for the greater good. But I just lost 5 men under my command, and it's going to eat at me for a bit. So just keep your mouth shut and walk, okay? White nodded solemnly as they continued their walk. The snow picked up again, and the wind coming off of the water put a significant chill on the 2 soldiers. White rubbed his arms for warmth, but the corporal seemed to be heated enough by his anger. Several minutes went by in silence, the duo constantly looking back over their shoulders to make sure they weren't being followed by corpses. Corporal DeVille, do you copy? Hooper's voice finally came through the communicator. DeVille smacked his with a frozen hand. I'm here, Captain, he said. Got a pickup spot for you, Hooper said. It's about 3 miles down the coast. Got 1 truck waiting for you by a beach access. They can see the water from where they are, so you can't miss them. We're picking up the pace, Captain, DeVille said. Be there in 30. Copy that, Hooper said. And, Corporal? DeVille took a breath. Yeah, Cap? He asked. Good job clearing that road, Hooper said. DeVille gritted his teeth. Thank you, sir, he replied, and the line went quiet. Come on, White. We have a rendezvous point. White had the intelligence not to say anything, simply nodding, and the 2 of them picked up the pace, ready to get back home. Chapter 8 General Stevens, Clint, Harmony, and Noah
were in the conference room with General Adams and John Teeter on video conferencing.
"General Adams, John, good to see you,"
Stevens greeted. John inclined his head.
"Good to see you as well, General," he replied. "Hope all is well in the Pacific Northwest today. Getting a nice snowfall, actually," Stevens replied. "Little bit on the chilly side, but beautiful to look at."
"General Stevens," Adams drawled impatiently,
"as much as I love to get your local weather report, are we ready to kick this meeting off yet?"
"Just about," Stevens replied.
"Waiting on—"
He paused as Gadd entered, and then smiled.
"Well, waiting on Corporal Gadd here to join us."
"Apologies, everyone," Gadd said as he swept into the room. "I was on the line with Captain Hooper, who sent a team to retrieve food from the Supercenter warehouse to the north." Stevens perked up.
"And?"
he asked. "Happy to report that the mission was successful," Gadd replied. "They are bringing in 7 tractor trailers filled with non-perishable goods. It's not going to be enough to fully solve our problem, but just might be enough to get us over the hump." Adams nodded.
"Good to hear, Corporal," he said.
"So, where does the food situation stand?"
Stevens inclined his head. "Clint, you want to field this one?" he asked.
"Sure," Clint replied, leaning back in his chair.
"General, John, as of right now, we have the community here on a strict 750-calorie-a-day diet."
John shook his head, blinking rapidly.
"That sounds a bit extreme," he said.
"That's barely a single solid meal."
"I agree," Clint replied. "But after weighing everything, we decided to err on the side of caution, as it's a lot easier to give more food later than take it away."
The men all shared nods, and John conceded.
"Understood," he said. "Depending on what's in this new shipment coming in, we might be able to raise that threshold by next week,"
Clint explained with a soft smile. Adams nodded, crossing his arms.
"How is the farm situation?" he asked gruffly. "I understand you were working on getting them operational again?" "Yes, sir," Clint replied, tapping his pencil on the clipboard in front of him. "Right now, we have 7 or 8 farms being prepped for planting. It's time-consuming, as we have to inspect the land for zombies and corpses before burning the fields. We have teams of qualified people working on it, but the most conservative estimate is 8 to 9 weeks before we start seeing anything significant from that."
He raised a palm.
"The good news, however, is once we get things rolling, it should be sustainable, and we can add more farms as we go."
"That is good to hear," John said, and motioned with his pencil. "May I ask, though, is that one of the farmers there at the table with you?" Clint inclined his head to Harmony.
"No, she's not. However, she is vitally important to what we're doing up here," he replied. "Gentlemen, this is Harmony Radicott. Before all this, she was kind of a regional celebrity, running one of the largest communes in the country, completely self-sufficient and off the grid."
"So, the hippie I always wanted to be in my heart?" John asked with a chuckle. Harmony winked. "It's not too late, John," she said, her voice musical. "Come on out here and I can put you to work." John smirked and shook his head before motioning for her to continue. "Since these 2 sought me out a few days ago, I have been hard at work with the other survivors from my commune," she explained, motioning between Clint and Gadd. "We have been busy converting every rooftop space into greenhouse gardens. With every hour that passes, we are putting more up, and once we get the power back to full in the safe zone, we will be able to utilize indoor spaces as well."
"We will get to the power situation in a moment, gentlemen," Stevens piped up, and Adams and John nodded to him before refocusing on Harmony.
"In addition to greenhouses, I have a list of items here that could help us get a fresh bread operation going," she said, and pulled a folded piece of paper out of her pocket and flattening it onto the table. "There are enough restaurants in the area that have the appropriate ovens we can use or convert, and enough raw material like sea salt, natural grain for flour, and yeast from houses and stores. If we play our cards right, we can make that self-sustaining as well. However, in the short term, it will be a boost to the food supply."
Stevens nodded, motioning to Gadd. "Corporal, at the conclusion of this meeting, I want you to focus all of your energy on getting Harmony what she needs," he said.
"Yes, sir," Gad replied, scribbling away on his notepad. "Harmony, with what you have in place right now, what sort of output do you think you're at?" John asked, leaning forward. She tilted her head back and forth. "Assuming the corporal here can get me what I need for the bread, and if some of the trainees we've recruited catch on quickly," she said, dragging out the word, "I'm confident that we can be meeting the 750-calorie-a-day limit for 25,000 people within a few weeks. As the time goes along and we add capacity, that number will go up." "Thank you, Harmony," John replied with a nod. "Back to the power situation for a moment," Adams cut in, raising a hand. "Obviously, you have some sort of power since you're on a video conference. But how is the situation overall?" Stevens rifled through his papers, finally grabbing one and pulling it out.
"The local hydro plant is operational, but limited capacity," he explained as he fixed his pile. "Right now, it's running at 20% output, which is enough for vital operations in the city as well as a few of the buildings we're using for housing. We have workers doing checks and repairs, and are fairly confident we'll be running at 50% in the next week or two. In addition to that, as we clear houses and buildings outside the immediate safe zone, we are flipping breakers to make sure that we aren't wasting power or risking an electrical fire," Gad piped up. "Good," John replied, and then ran a finger down the list in front of him. "How is the security situation?" he asked. "The perimeter around the civilians is very secure, with every building inside it clear and hardened positions at every possible breach point," Clint replied. "Outside of that, work is moving slowly, mostly for safety reasons."
Adams cocked a brow. "Safety reasons?" he asked.
"Yes, General," Clint replied stiffly. "Ammunition is virtually exhausted, which means the men clearing out the buildings have to do so by hand. Gad and I saw this with our own eyes a few days ago, and it's not easy. Some of these clear teams only have enough bullets to put one in their own heads if they get bitten, which isn't ideal."
Adams nodded slowly. "Have we heard from Captain Kersey and his expedition to Idaho?" he asked.
"Yes, General," Stevens said. "He had secured several ammunition factories. However, there is a complication."
Adams sighed. "Complication?" he asked.
"Regional resistance in the form of militias," Stevens replied. "We are still assessing their strength and how much of a threat they pose, but Captain Kersey feels like it's a big enough threat that he's requested more men."
"Give him whatever he needs," Adams declared. "We need that ammunition."
"Already on it," Stevens assured him.
"Good man," Adams replied with a sharp nod. "Speaking of expeditions," John piped up, "how is the situation north of the border?" "The mission was a success," Gad replied with a smile. "The team we sent was able to secure the oil fields and have started the pipeline up again, albeit in a limited fashion. We are expecting to receive oil at the refinery within a week, and as we inspect the lines to make sure there isn't a problem, the flow will ramp up." John rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "How can we speed that process up?" he asked.
Clint shook his head. "Unfortunately, we really can't speed it up at all," he replied. "We only have a handful of refinery workers with any sort of experience, so it's difficult getting new workers up to speed since the people with all of the knowledge are working 12, 14-hour shifts trying to get things moving again." "I will send you a list over after this meeting," John replied, scribbling on his paper. "It's a census of every single VIP we have in the stadiums. You find the people you need, and we will provide you with the appropriate satellite uplink time for these new workers to be tutored by experts in the field. I don't know how many refinery workers we have in the stadiums, but if our troops did the job right, there should be some." "Thank you," Clint replied with a nod. "I'll be on the lookout for that."
"Stevens, what else are you doing to find resources for the safe zone?" Adams asked after a short lull in conversation.
"Having exhausted the resources in close-by areas, we have put together civilian long-range scout teams," Stevens replied, leaning back in his chair. "They'll be provided the equipment and supplies they need to venture out for days at a time, 100 or 200 miles out, hitting every small town looking for supplies. It's a long shot, but the people need something to stay busy."
"Speaking of that, we also have several people working on entertainment options," Noah piped up from behind his mass of folders. "Movies, concerts, sports, rec leagues." Adams scoffed.
We have a potential mass starvation event unfolding, and you are worried about movies and sports? He demanded.
Yes, sir, I am, Noah replied, not withering a bit under the gruff general's steel gaze. If people are hungry, they're a lot less likely to act out if they have something distracting them from that fact. Adams and John exchanged a look and then shrugged.
Very well,
Adams finally said.
Just put it on the back burner.
Noah waved a dismissive hand, not even looking at him. Okay, General, he said.
How are we on internal security? John prompted, leaning forward. I understand that the civilian population is safe from a zombie attack, but what about internal threats? We have military personnel providing basic security and acting as EMS and firefighters, Clint explained. Noah here is poring over the census data they're collecting at the stadium and pulling any that claim to be law enforcement or first responders. However, it's all but impossible to check if they're telling the truth.
Gad nodded. We are, however, putting a test together for them to pass, he said. We have enough confirmed people from the Seattle Stadium that are putting together the appropriate tests for the various fields. If you need more resources, let me know, and I'll patch you through to the stadium with the knowledge you need, John said.
Thank you, Clint replied.
Adams took a deep breath.
Is there anything else that needs to be covered?
He asked, pressing his palms together.
Just one,
Stevens said, and then swiveled his chair to look at Clint.
You're the one who brought it up to me. Go ahead and tell them.
The two men focused on him, and he straightened.
We need to talk about getting the civilians in this camp representation, he said.
Adams scoffed. With everything that's going on, they should just be happy that they're alive and not facing death from all sides, he snapped.
That's easy to say when you're on the side controlling everything, Clint shot back. Now, Corporal Gad here had an incident a few days ago where a soldier made up a story to trick civilians into working back-breaking jobs for no gain. He managed to put that particular fire out, but it's hard to imagine that's the only situation like that happening here.
He raised his chin, gaze like ice.
Now, I fully understand that letting people vote in elections to get a new government formed isn't in the cards at the moment, but there needs to be a way for them to get someone who represents their interests directly to us.
Adams thought for a moment and seemed to concede the good point as his shoulders relaxed.
What do you propose? He finally asked. At the very least, we should allow each housing building, either permanent or temporary, to vote for a representative to be their spokesperson,
Clint suggested, and then motioned to his companions on his side of the table.
Once a week, Corporal Gad, Noah, and myself will sit down with them for a meeting. We'll tell them everything that is going on, proper procedures and whatnot, and it's beneficial to us as well, since we'll have a direct line to the people and their problems.
He raised his chin in solidarity.
Would go a long way towards throwing water on any fires before they become an inferno.
Adams nodded slowly. Very well, do what you need to do, he confirmed. And if they ask about restarting the government, just tell them we're working on it.
Yes, sir,
Clint replied. The general looked around the room. Is that all? He asked. The group all exchanged glances, and enough nods and nobody speaking made it clear that it seemed that it was.
I think we're all set here, Stevens said.
You're all doing great work, John said with a smile. Keep it up, and we'll get through this winter.
Clint nodded. Thank you, he replied, and I'll be on the lookout for your message.
John nodded, and the monitor went dark. Everybody looked around the room at each other, taking a brief moment of peace and silence before chaos kicked in again.
All right, everybody,
Stevens finally said, pressing his palms on the table.
It's nearly dinner time, and there's still a full day's worth of work to get done. Let's make it happen.
There was a chorus of half-hearted yes sirs around the table, as everyone pushed their chairs back, collecting their folders and papers. The situation was slowly beginning to point in the right direction, but there was still a lot of work and a whole lot of luck required to come out the other side. The end.